Hi there, I'm Neil Armstrong from Tribepad, and we're talking about the End Ghosting campaign, which is all about how to reduce this horrible problem of people applying for roles and then not hearing back from the employer. Really delighted today to be joined by Phil Moore. So Phil's at the British Medical Association. He's in charge of human resources operations there. Prior to that, Phil's worked in all kinds of different industries, lots of experience with IBM and technology, also worked in logistics, retail, all kinds of different experience. So really interested to hear what you've got to think about this, Phil. And yeah, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Yes, you're welcome. It didn't take much persuasion for me to come along today and join the conversation, because being responsible for recruitment provision as I am, and having experienced the ghosting phenomenon from at first hand, as you know, as a candidate in the past, you know, it's something I've got strong a passion about, let's say.
So tell us a bit more about that. It sounds like you've had a particular incident that sort of spurned you on there. What happened?
Well, it's incidents, really. I mean, I can give a few examples. I think most recently I was in between roles, let's say a couple of years ago, and a lot of my applications were you know, from LinkedIn or from various sort of big hitter job boards. And some of my experiences were that I you know, it's the one-click apply that I've sort of lost faith in a little, because I would go on a link and LinkedIn. I'm not saying it's the platform necessarily, but you go on the one-click apply, and then you wouldn't hear anything, and I wouldn't even get so much as a confirmation that I'd applied for the position, let alone, you know, not even the automated email.
Wow.
Then to not get anything beyond the automated email anyway is bad enough, but not even to get confirmation. So I kept thinking, have I applied for this? So I'd apply again using one of my other emails, because I've got a couple of email addresses like most people. So I use another email address and I try that way, thinking, well, let's make sure that this got through. But then you think, is the recruiter seeing this guy who's bombarding them with multiple applications? You know, forget about it. He's a joker. Are they just missing it? But still, you get nothing. And I can't help but say that's very frustrating. And this was for sort of senior level roles. And on a less senior level, I was in between roles again at the early days of lockdown, and I was looking for something to keep me going, to pay the bills. We didn't want to keep dipping into savings the whole period. So I was going for some driving roles, and we looked at, you know, Uber, taxi driving, and I looked at some of the supermarket chains to do delivery work, and looked at a big online retailer whose name I won't mention, but it was a big online retailer. And I applied, and I heard nothing for months and months, for weeks and weeks, for the online retailer. And finally I got a message from them. But I applied for 2, maybe 3 supermarket chains, and I didn't get a dicky back from them, which made me really laugh. The other day, I got an email, the GDPR notice email, saying, we've had your name and details on file now for over 12 months. If you don't wish to continue to have presence on our database, please let us know. And I thought, you swines, you know, you didn't tell me about this bloody job I applied for, you know, a couple of years ago, yet you have the temerity to now ask me if you can keep my details on your database. And I was like, that was an easy decision to make. But
it's not difficult to see why there's such frustration out there, is it? And you know, particularly what you were talking now about, in terms of, it's a stressful time where you are, you know, you're responsible for your income, your family's well-being, and that's you've already got pressure on your shoulders. So you know, as you say, at least hearing something back, even an automated response in the early days, is you know, really important. I mean, this research that we've carried out suggests that this problem's, you know, really widespread. And you know, this ghosting behavior, where, you know, you don't hear anything back, is more than 2/3 of the UK public have actually experienced it. And you know, you yourself, you just told several different examples where you've experienced. And what the research shows is 94% of those people say they're left with negative feelings towards that brand. You know, I wonder, has that, you know, based on your experiences, have you changed your shopping behaviors or your buying behaviors or anything like that? Or is it not been quite, you know? quite that extreme.
I wouldn't say broadly. I haven't had this unilateral, that's it, I'm done with them, full stop. But there has been certain, it has impacted me, and I've thought twice about, using certain suppliers, as it were.
And what do you think's going on? Sorry, Graham. What do you think's going on there? Because obviously, as recruiters, nobody would ever choose to do that to a candidate, and we know how important this stuff is, and we know candidate experience is crucial. So, why is this going wrong? What can recruiters do? Is it within recruiters' control, or is it something in hiring managers? Is it technology? Is it process? Where's this going wrong?
Well, I talked about the volume side of it, and it's this one-click apply, and I wonder if there's something about the volumes that one-click apply is producing to an organization that is, a lot of that has to then be automated, because you can't have a recruiter sifting through hundreds, if not thousands of CVs or applications. Because we had, in my early days working in recruitment at IBM, we'd open, we're talking over 10 years ago, SAP, back when that was the big HR software on the marketplace. We'd open a position for an SAP developer, and we'd get hundreds of applications almost immediately, mostly from overseas. We were recruiting for the whole of the EMEA region back in those days, but even then we were getting people applying for roles way outside of the EMEA region, and we didn't have the technology at hand to set up these killer questions, etc., to automatically reject, have you got right to work in this location, etc. So we're having to do that manually, but we still did it manually. These days, because you've got the technology hypothetically set up to automate that early side of the screening process, I wonder if, just because of the number of applications that they're getting, because of the one-click apply approach, I can't help but wonder if somehow this isn't set up adequately, or they haven't thought it through.
There's a volume problem and an automation problem.
I'd say I'm not saying that is the sole purpose, the sole cause of this, but I can't help but think that has an impact, because we, as we've just recently set ourselves up with the Tribepad software. But when we designed that application process, when we configured it, we were really, got into the minutiae of detail about what the candidate experience looked like. And it wasn't just the candidate that was successfully taken to onboarding, it was the candidates that got through to interview or got rejected at the first killer question. We made sure that there was an automated email, and the content of the automated email was appropriate, and the language was positive, and so on and so forth, because the marketplace twists and turns, and although we're a recognizable brand, not all positions that we open are going to be inundated with applicants. So we have to be, take care of these people, and you see your scores on the online, the Glassdoors and whatnot, and it does have an impact on the marketplace. So you've got to be careful.
We know it's increasingly a candidate-driven marketplace. It's effectively a buyer's market, and therefore, if you have a great experience with an employer, even if you're not successful in getting the job, you might tell a couple of friends. But if you get ghosted, if you have a terrible experience, particularly if you've got further along in the process and you've invested time in perhaps completing screening questionnaires or some assessments, or maybe even been to interview and then don't hear anything, you're going to go and tell 8-9 people about that. Your friends, your family,
absolutely.
Everybody's going to know about that, and that's that can't be good for the brand.
No.
I heard a term the other day, corporate arrogance, which is this idea. I quite liked it. It's this idea that an organisation, particularly a successful, relatively well-known organisation, feels that, aren't these candidates so lucky to come and work here, and therefore there's a risk there of perhaps becoming a bit dismissive towards those candidates who aren't successful. And it's not it's not individual behavior, but perhaps just this sort of group think feeling. Do you think, does that sound like it's a possibility?
Yes, I'd absolutely. There's a culture in certain organisations, and I've been involved in organisations similar to this in the past, that there's such a strong belief in the brand that they don't treat candidates or staff as cannon fodder as such, but there's sort of, you know, a diminished, I don't know, collective responsibility or appreciation for the staff or candidates, that they believe the brand is so strong that they're always going to get people coming. So if we disappoint X percentage of candidates, so be it. It's collateral damage to them, and I absolutely, you know, it's a horrible thing to think that we live in that sort of in that world, but at the same time, it doesn't really come as too much of a surprise. We see the space race of senior people going off to, you know, fly a rocket to the moon is more important to them than, you know, the well-being of their employees. And it's, I'm not saying that's black and white, but it certainly appears to be on the face of it. So that you can't help but believe in that arrogance is commonplace.
And I mean, it's interesting you bring up well-being there. You know, there's two sides to this coin. You know, we saw from the research that you know, candidates can in some way end up blaming themselves for things going wrong, and it can affect, you know, have long-term effects in terms of their well-being and how deeply upset they are by the experience. There was some difference in how genders experience this ghosting issue, and again, so, you know, in the report it breaks that down. But one thing that perhaps we haven't really touched on is the well-being of recruiters, where we know recruiters are being asked to do more with less. We know lots of organizations went through challenges of, you know, perhaps furloughs, redundancies, certainly hiring freezes in the last year, are now being asked to rebuild with fewer resources. We know that there's wage inflation. We know the Great Resignation is affecting everybody. So, you know, what about the well-being of recruiters? How are TA professionals feeling right now?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, we've got a very different recruitment model at the BMA. We don't actually have an in-house recruitment team. Our recruiters are line managers effectively, and we provide a level of support to them to do that. We are looking to change that model over the next few months. But certainly historically, I've certainly worked with, you know, very substantial recruitment teams. Again, I'll draw back to my experience with IBM. In those days, we had a recruitment team of over 80 in a shared services centre, but we were supporting 150,000 plus employees in the region and the various organisations we supported. And it's a real thing. It's a real thing. I don't know how much we are embracing technology for the sake of the hands-on approach, that, you know, there's this belief that unless the recruiter is dealing with people hands-on, not face-to-face, but in person, rather than relying on technology to support that. And, you know, I mentioned earlier about having these killer questions embedded in the early side of a process. If you think, because again, we partnered with an organisation when I was at IBM, and they refused to use the killer questions because they maintained that they wanted a personal approach. And what if something got missed in that process? They wanted a recruiter to be looking at it, saying, but it's not an efficient way of spending our time. We were big on productivity, and it's not productive use of our recruiters' time to be sifting through a CV or profile that wouldn't otherwise get through and would still not get through. So I can't help but think we're relying too much on that human touch and that human element, and not putting that confidence in the technology. And we, I say at the BMA, we don't use this willy-nilly as a broad rule of thumb, but there's certainly been positions where we said, look, there's no point in screening. We had, I think, something like 80 candidates for one position, for example, which is quite a lot by BMA standards. And we hadn't set up the killer questions, and the poor line manager was having to go through all 80 CVs. And you know, I gave a bit of support, but they wanted to do it themselves. And I said, well, after all of that, they actually shortlisted to 6. We interviewed, and you know, it turned out that none of them were quite good enough. So we went again. I said, look, we don't want another 80 candidates. Let's use the killer questions, and it worked. You know, we got a better the first level of screening that just filtered out all of the, you know, the chances and the people who just wanted a bit of a break. Unfortunately, this wasn't the right position for them, so we had to weed them out. So I don't know how much we lean on our recruiters to do these sort of perfunctory tasks that otherwise we can automate and use technology support. And because of that, to your point, they're inundated, they're overwhelmed, and things fall through, and you can't help but wonder if they've got to prioritize, they've got to triage their workload, and how much of benefit do they really feel if they're going to be rejecting somebody or keeping someone fluffed, as it were, rather than actually getting on with supporting interview process and actually onboarding and
I think, that certainly feels like, as a hiring manager, your priority is to fill your vacancy, and you've got to sort the wheat from the chaff and find the great candidates as quickly as you can, because almost certainly those candidates are applying for many other roles at the same time. And therefore, if you have a several week process, to get through to a, second, third, or maybe even a fourth stage interview, they've probably, the good candidate's gone somewhere else by then. So I think, as you say, there's risks with using technology, and in the early stages where things can be impersonal. You're not buying a tin of beans here. You're making a life choice about an organization to come and work for a year, 2 year, 3 years. But it's that balance, isn't it, between getting the human touch right, and that's what great line managers and really good recruiters do. Is you're selling the organization to somebody who's making a life choice. But in order to get to that position, as you say, you can't do that with 80 CVs realistically in a timescale. Particularly as a hiring manager, when recruitment's probably a very, very small part of your role.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I mean, I think of another experience I had probably about 8 or 9 years ago now. Again, looking to change role, and it was with quite a sizable tech company, and I successfully went through 2 or 3 lines of the process, but then it got to the final step or the final steps, and it took an inordinate amount of time. We're talking 3 or 4 months to go from my 3rd interview to actually getting the selection. And the recruiter, again, and I felt almost sorry for them that they were in the middle. And again, you talked about earlier that you mentioned, the blame you put on yourself. I find myself getting a bit tetchy with the recruiter, and I find myself pestering the recruiter saying, come on, this is ridiculous. I've been sitting around waiting for a long time. I've got other positions. I really like the look of this one, but there's something else on the horizon that I also like the look of. And, I want to focus myself and not spread myself too thinly.
Yeah.
And eventually they didn't go with me. They went with somebody else, that the in-house, I think it was a consultant they had filling the gap, and they decided to take it on permanently. But they'd kept me warm and fluffed me up for months on end. And it just, it's a side of, it's not ghosting as such, but it's certainly, at one end of that spectrum where I wasn't necessarily being ghosted, but I wasn't necessarily being given the full facts. I wasn't being kept involved in the correct, the appropriate conversation all along. And I just felt I was being fobbed off. And it made me really cross, and it absolutely drew the line under my ever potentially joining that organization again, without a shadow of doubt. And so, I read the report this week. I've read it in a few stages, and what is alarming isn't so much that ghosting goes on, because that's actually a given now, because everybody I speak to say, oh it's happened. It's
just become accepted, isn't it?
Yeah, we're now measuring how much it impacts you. It's not just we're saying, does it happen? We're saying, well, we get it happens, but how hard has that impacted your emotional well-being, your appreciation of the recruitment process per se? It's a terrible situation, and I don't know whether the curve is going up or down. Are things getting worse, or are things actually going to improve?
I mean, it certainly seems like it's definitely become more of an issue in the media, and that was one of the reasons why we commissioned this report. Was we were looking at it going, this problem seems to be getting worse, which is counterintuitive, because more and more organizations have the technology to be able to give those simple automated confirmation, we have your application, or even a really early, you failed our killer questions, I'm sorry, this isn't for you, click here to join our talent pool and look out for future opportunities that might be better suited to you. It's like there's literally zero cost to do. for an organization. And I totally get that once you're into interviews in particular, and perhaps even the offer stage, if you've got a favored candidate who you're offering, but you've perhaps got another one or two who are actually nearly as good, but not quite your first choice, naturally, you're not going to go back to them and say, oh, actually, your second or third choice, can you just hang around for a few weeks while I try and conclude the contract with my first choice? Of course, you're not going to do that. And so that sounds like that period you were in, where that anxiety and the anger towards the organization of being left in this communications black hole, that seems like a time where that's a harder problem to solve. But the early stuff where you don't even get a confirmation that you've applied, that's just nuts.
Yes, there's no excuse for that. But as you said, it's even a cost efficient way to manage it. And if you think about the impact to a brand, and you think about the cost efficiency to manage that first step into the candidate process, there's absolutely no excuse. And
so coming back to what's interesting about the BMA there is where you have this devolved responsibility for recruitment, where the hiring managers are doing it themselves with guidance from central experts. So what guidance do you give those hiring managers, and what are the things that you'd like to see improve? I know things are pretty good there already in terms of what the candidate experience is and the communication points, because a lot of thought's gone into it. But how are you looking to take that to the next level for your organisation?
Well, we are looking at changing our model, but that aside, there's an organic nature to the process. We're 6-8 months into life with Tribepad. So it's probably a good time to sort of introspect, reflect, and see where we are, and have a look at the data in the system to see how our line managers are managing the process. We don't have the bandwidth to go in and check every single time. Are you giving feedback? Are you responding to the questionnaires? Although anecdotally, I tend to see that is being done. I did go in the other day to check a historic position that I was asked to refer to by somebody, and I saw that we had, ashamedly, given the context of the conversation, I saw we had 6 candidates that hadn't been moved from in review, and therefore they've been sitting in review for an inordinate amount of time, and I thought, I was embarrassed, because I thought, I've got to have this conversation with Neil this week, and how can I look him in the eye and tell him that, damn you, ghosted.
It's funny you bring that up. So we have a couple of features, and I'm sure other platforms do as well, where you can auto close jobs after a certain amount of time and auto communicate with candidates after a certain amount of time. But we don't tend to turn those on by default, because actually, if you haven't positively decided exactly how your process works, that could be quite intrusive. But one of the things we're sort of looking at now is considering that these options of, well, actually, like your donor card, when people had to opt in to be a donor, you got whatever rate. Whereas then a few years ago, the process changed so that by default, you're a donor unless you opt out. The whole nudge theory. And so we're thinking, okay, well, how can we actually help people deliver something better with that nudge theory sort of approach, where, well, let's put this stuff on by default, so that actually a hiring manager doesn't have to remember to close the job. Because once you've hired somebody, of course your mind's going to move on to whatever is the next problem in your day. Let's let the software take the load for you.
I've just written that down, Neil, because I'll be honest with you, I didn't know that existed. Because what I'm thinking, and having seen that this week, I'm thinking, well, how can I make sure this doesn't happen again? And this isn't about me saving face in conversations like this. This is about me doing the right thing. I don't want to put people through that, because it's just not right. And I was thinking, we'll just do a cleanup exercise. We'll do a monthly spot check. We don't have that many positions that we can't do this. If we're just looking at face value, do we have candidates still sitting in one of the channels in the pipeline, that we'll do a monthly spot check? But if I can automate that.
Well, I guess there's a wider point here, isn't there? Of part of the reason for commissioning this report was to shine a torch on a problem we know exists, but we think is not a good thing and is getting worse. And so the things that come out of that are okay, let's review our candidate experience. Let's engage with hiring managers. Let's talk to our technology vendors to find, are there features in the system that we're not using or could be using in a different way? And that sounds like a great outcome from this chat individually. If nothing, if other people watching this, go and have that same realization, a conversation with their vendor. Maybe there's something easy they can do that small improvements compound up to make a big difference, don't they?
Yeah, and again, because we're looking to bring in some in-house support to the recruitment process, because we also want to reduce agency spend, as most people do.
Yeah,
we're looking to sort of replicate that support, the sourcing side in-house. So I think it won't be just a source. There'll be a sort of a larger scope to that role, and one of them will be to manage the platform use. So it just takes that onus away from the manager, because like every other organization you've probably worked with or been in, managers will always tell me that their day job is to, the Burberry way was, I'm here to sell trench coats and scarves, not to be a manager. My targets around sales incentives, not closing out candidates properly in a system.
Absolutely.
So, the less of that they need to do, the more of that we can automate, the better for everybody, really.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point to end on. I think is, we're there to help people take the burden off, knowing that they've got 1,000,001 things to do. Nobody's deliberately causing angst to somebody else. It's about how can we fix it. So,
but if you sat down and talked to them, they would 100% agree with you. I guarantee it. There's a little, not ignorance is the right word. It's just, it doesn't sit on certain people's radars, and I'm absolutely certain if they had visibility of this conversation, or if I sat down and spoke to every single one of them, they'd all agree robustly, my God, this is the right thing to do. How could they'd hate to think that was a reflection of them personally or the organization.
Absolutely. Well, Phil, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting. We'll follow up with you, of course, on the project on how you're changing structure and process there. The link for anybody is end-ghosting.com. The link's in the comments. Love anybody out there to support this campaign and just try to highlight this issue and try to do something about it so we can improve things for everybody. So Phil, thank you again for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Neil.
No problem.